All right, everybody, welcome back to the final subsection of Section 6 of our public policy course. And this subsection is all about control, right? How do we make sure that people follow the rules we've made? How do we make sure that organizations or individuals who are subject to this rule make sure, how do we make sure they comply with it? How do we make sure they're going to do what that rule says they should do? And there kind of falls into two different categories. There's carrots and sticks, right? And that's the kind of informal way to say that we can either give benefits or something good to people who do follow the rule, or, that's the carrot, and then the stick is punishing people or doing something bad to the people who don't follow the rule. And control mechanisms can fall into one or the other or both, right? But ultimately, what we're looking for here is compliance. We want people to follow these rules. We want any given law or regulation to take effect, to actually affect people's or organizations or businesses' behavior, right? And one of the biggest factors in that is legitimacy. When individuals feel like a criminal law is legitimate, they're much more likely to follow it. And legitimacy is affected by a whole bunch of things from, was the proper procedure taken to create that rule? Is it enforced fairly? Was it kind of done in the open? Was this rule created in an open manner that allowed people to comment, that allowed objections to be raised, et cetera, et cetera? So legitimacy is something that any kind of government agency, from a police officer on the streets or an inspector working for the EPA, all the way up to the president and the congressional members, it's something that all of them have to kind of be aware of and take into account when trying to enforce or not enforce a certain rule. Okay? Now, the kind of lowest level, the easiest level of control are non-coercive methods, right? And these are kind of where there's neither a carrot nor a stick. This is where we just kind of make a rule, and we don't enforce it so much. We just kind of we provide other motives for people to abide by this rule of their own free will, right? So one of those things is like voluntary standards, right? So, the EPA might come out with a voluntary standard that says, hey, there are these certain chemicals that are not necessarily really toxic, because those have very strict rules. But we think that, this kind of chemical should be carried in this color or this size container. And we're not going to, punish you if you don't do that, but, that's kind of, we're going to make this standard, we're going to set this rule, even though it's completely unenforceable, and then just kind of hope that through agreement, because it benefits everybody to follow these standards, people will be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, we can do it that way. So maybe, and I have no idea if this was an actual voluntary standard or not, so don't message me about this. But some government agency might have said, like, hey, USB-C should be the standard for phone charging in the United States. If you want to sell phone chargers, if you want to manufacture a cell phone, try to use the USB-C charging port. And obviously that's not enforceable, right? So at least as of time of recording, Apple products still use non-USB-C chargers. But when organizations covered by that rule kind of see the benefit in everybody doing it the same way, they might just kind of do it voluntarily, right? Then, of course, there's mediation. That's a non-coercive form of control. And mediation, a lot of times, like when labor groups and management groups in certain industries have conflicts over anything from new employment contracts to things that aren't necessarily covered by law, the government can come in and kind of mediate between the two groups and and sit down with them and be kind of this neutral third party and say, hey, what are your problems? What are your problems? What are some possible solutions? Let's kind of mediate an agreement between you two. We're not forcing them into agreeing to anything, but just the fact that they can come in as a third party and mediate a dispute between these two non-governmental groups can help make sure that employees remain happy, employers remain happy, or any two groups that are kind of having a disagreement. The government can also just publicize things like, hey, we really want you to follow this rule. Here's the benefits that this rule gives us, right? If you store explosive chemicals too near any given populated area, here's the bad things that could result. So we think you should abide by this rule. And we're going to bring attention to this group is not doing it, and that's dangerous. And, but bringing publicity to any given situation is a non-coercive way for the government to kind of get compliance with a rule or standard that they've set. And then, of course, there's educational programs, right? So the government might come out with an educational program about, hey, here's the benefits of vaccines. Here's all the great things that being vaccinated can do. Here's how the anti-vaccine activists are lying to you. Here's how, this is a common conspiracy theory about the evils of vaccines, and that's not true. And here's all this scientific evidence that shows that vaccines are safe and effective. And they can kind of get us to comply with different rules about vaccinations in that way. Now, another thing they can do is inspection, right? So lots of different federal agencies do all kinds of different inspections of different organizations and businesses and buildings and stuff. And there's two different kinds of inspections they can do. There's the periodic and there's the continuous, right? So the periodic inspections might be like, at construction sites. OSHA might go in and inspect construction sites, and we don't know where, we don't know when, but they might come in and say, hey, you have employees not wearing hard hats, and you have, this railing needs to be higher, and all that kind of things. Or IRS audits are a good example of a periodic inspection. Are you paying the proper amount of taxes every year? And then there's the continuous inspection, right? So like food processing plants, whether you're making poultry or beef or any kind of food stuff that is going to be sold to consumers, there's a continuous inspection process where members from, say, the FDA have to be in your plant or in your factory making sure that you're complying with FDA rules. Licensing is another way of gaining control and compliance with different rules and standards. So if you want to be a doctor, that's great, but you have to get a license to be a doctor before you are legally allowed to advertise or act as a doctor. If you want to be a police officer, you have to get licensed. If you want to be a lawyer, you have to get licensed. So essentially, they're ensuring control and rule compliance through saying, like, you have to follow these steps, you have to abide by this process, you have to go through all these, jump through all these hoops in order to make sure that you are complying with our rules and regulations and standards, and you're not just, some idiot who wants to go out and cut into people and take out their gallbladder. We need to make sure you can do that safely and effectively and not just, cut somebody's abdominal wall open and choose a random organ and say, oh, that's your gallbladder, and then take it out, right? We don't want that to happen. So this licensing process is a good way for standards and rules to be controlled by the U.S. government. They can give loans or subsidies, right? So if you're abiding by the rules, if something, if you're following these steps, here's some money, right? We want to reward you for doing this. We want to, we're going to offer these loans to every business in this field who abides by this standard. So if I'm in that business, I'm going to say, oh, wow, I'm going to abide by those standards. I'm going to abide by those rules so I can get all that free money, right? So that's a way to make sure that the U.S. government, it is a way for the U.S. government to make sure that people are following those rules and standards, etc. Who the government chooses to do business with, right? Because the government has to do business with private companies all the time. So, NASA buys rockets from private companies. The Department of Defense buys airplanes from private companies. The Department of Veterans Affairs has to purchase desks and medicines and, all this other stuff. So through their contracts that they sign with those companies for services or products, through the stuff they purchase, they can make sure that whatever company they're purchasing from has to be abiding by this rule or this standard or have this, minimum wage, right? The president can make a rule, and I believe at least some presidents have, that we're only going to purchase items and services from companies where the minimum wage is set at X amount of money. And that's a way for the president to increase the minimum wage, not for everybody, but for a large part of the American people, which doesn't have to go through Congress and become an actual law to raise the minimum wage nationwide. Because if the government's only going to purchase from companies where their personal company minimum wage is above X number, a huge chunk of the companies within the United States want to get those nice, juicy government contracts. So they're going to set their minimum wage to that level, so they'll be eligible to sell their products or their services or whatever to the United States government. Of course, there's taxation, right? The process of taxation can be used to influence behavior and get people to change, whether they're abiding by a rule or a law or is able to control their behavior just through the sheer power of taxation. And there's kind of two different ways to do this. The first is to increase taxes on the things we don't want people to do. These are commonly called sin taxes, right? So both the federal government and state and local governments have at different times and at different periods of history and in different places taxed things like cigarettes or alcohol or gasoline or things that government, whether it's the national government or local government or whatever, we don't want people to use that product. So we're going to increase taxes on that product to make it less attractive for consumers to buy that product, right? And then the other direction is tax breaks, right? Oh, we're going to give a tax cut to every company that hires a certain number of women for its executive board, or we're going to give tax breaks to companies that reduce their pollution by X percent or whatever. So we can kind of change how companies or even individuals act by offering tax breaks if they do certain things that we want them to do. Informal proceedings. These are another way that agencies can kind of get people to comply. They can just, instead of going through a formal process, they can, some representative of an agency can go to an organization and say, hey, look, you guys are not following this rule. We really need you to follow this rule. What can I do to help you come into compliance with this rule or change your behavior in this way? To where it's not like going through some kind of formal adjudication process. It's kind of an informal process where the person kind of, on the ground doing the job can kind of say, hey, look, I don't want to have to do any kind of formal anything, but let's work together. Let's work to make sure that you're following this rule. You're not going to get in trouble for doing the wrong thing, or you can get this benefit for doing the right thing. But what do you need? Do you disagree with the rule? Are you having trouble implementing it? Are you having trouble abiding by it? What's going on? And so they can use that kind of informal, just kind of person-to-person contact to kind of help make problems go away before they become a really big problem, right? And then, of course, the most severe form of control is with sanctions. And sanctions can take the form of anything from a fine to some kind of punishments like community service, or you have to do this thing or that thing, or you're forbidden from doing business in this field for the next 5 years or whatever, all the way up to, prison, right? So, of course, in criminal law, that's kind of the most obvious form of sanctions being used as a control mechanism for following rules and dictating behavior. But it can also happen outside of the criminal law system. There are all kinds of sanctions that come down all the time on different businesses for not following certain rules, whether it's pollution rules or worker safety rules or whatever. And again, usually these fall into the form of fines in the non-criminal realm, but not always. But one of the big problems with sanctions is the severity has to be kind of at the right level, right? Not so severe that it becomes burdensome, but not too low of a severity to where it doesn't become a problem, So if a company can violate a rule and that increases their profits by $100 million, and then they get caught and the sanction is only $10 million, well, they're still making a $90 million profit, so the sanction really is not going to force them into compliance. Who cares, right? If we get caught and we still making a huge profit by ignoring this rule, then the sanction does nothing. We're still going to violate that rule. So sanctions have to be kind of geared to the point where they can even theoretically be effective. And if they're too low, they're not going to be effective. But if they're too high, that can also lead to some serious problems as well. All right. We finally reached the end of section 6. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you guys.